Hi, I'm Kim Rubenstein. I'm a professor of law at the University of Canberra, and I started teaching constitutional law in 1993.
And hi, I'm James Blackwell. I'm a Wiradjuri man and a research fellow at the ANU and member of the Uluru Dialogue at UNSW.
This year is such an important year for the Australian Constitution because we're being asked to change it. Now, if you want to change something, you really have to know what it is that you're changing. So this podcast series is to introduce you to the Australian Constitution, all aspects of it, to help you when you make your decision about this referendum.
So join us for this 8-part series as we explore the Constitution, the law, the vibe of the thing, and Indigenous issues in this really important referendum year.
And indeed, it's not just the vibe, it's the Constitution.
In summing up, it's the Constitution, it's Mabo, it's justice, it's law, it's the vibe, and no, that's it, it's the vibe.
That was sensational.
So here we are in a session to look at separation of powers in the Australian Constitution. And in another episode, I've talked about the fact that the American Constitution was a great influence on the Australian Constitution, that many of the framers of the Constitution had read and even were writing to various American politicians about their setup. And so when you actually look at the structure of the Australian Constitution, you could also be looking at the structure of the US Constitution. And by that I mean that there are various chapters in the Australian Constitution. So, James, when you open up your little yellow book there, you can see there's Chapter 1, the Parliament, which has two parts, a general part and the Senate. Then there is Part 3, which is the House of Representatives, Part 4, both Houses of the Parliament, and Part 5, Powers of the Parliament. So there's some of the things that we looked at when we were talking about federalism in another episode. But that's all part of Chapter 1, Parliament. So that's the Parliament is one power that is established, institutional power that's established in the Constitution. Then when we move to Chapter 2, it's called the Executive Government. And here it sets up that there is a separate area of power called executive power. And when I teach my students, I talk about the fact that when Parliament introduces a piece of legislation, something like the Migration Act, then they also have to introduce things to execute or administer that act, and that's called executive power. So the actual running, the day-to-day decision-making that is about implementing decisions under the Act, that's all an expression of executive power, and that is its own chapter of the Constitution. And I'll come back to that in a little bit more detail. And then there's the third chapter, which is the judicature, which is the judiciary. So having a court that is a separate institutional body. So those three parts of the Constitution mirror what's in the US Constitution as in separate institutional structures for your parliament, your executive and the judiciary. So that's a good starting point of just understanding that that's in the Constitution. But I guess the question is, why do you need to have separate powers? Why not just have it all mixed in together? And this is where some political theory and science comes in, and maybe you've got a few ideas here too, I'm sure you do, James, in terms of, you know, the idea of separation of power and power.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, just on the idea of chapters before we get into the political theory stuff, because that gets a bit dense. My favourite chapter of the Constitution, before we get to the voice topic later on, and because that obviously proposes a new chapter, but it's Chapter 7, which is miscellaneous. It's the most Australian chapter, I think, in the document because it contains Canberra. Canberra is contained in the everything else chapter, which is my favourite little quirk of the Constitution, that the section 125, which relates to the seat of government, which sets up Canberra, where I work, where you live and work, is in the miscellaneous chapter, which of course is very indicative of how Australia generally treats Canberra and the ACT.
Oh, well, now that you've mentioned
the miscellany.
Well, now you've mentioned Section 125, I have to bring in another little bit of information before we go back to separation of powers. And this is about how this section I often use to show that there were clearly no women at the drafting of the Constitution. Because if you read Section 125, it says that the seat of government of the Commonwealth is to be determined by the Parliament and shall be within territory which shall have been granted to the Commonwealth for making it the capital. And it shall be in the state of New South Wales and be distant not less than 100 miles from Sydney. Now, this is because there was this rivalry. This is going back to our federalism topic, rivalry between the Victorian and New South Wales delegates as to where the capital would be. And so their truce was that if it was going to be in New South Wales, it had to be at least 100 miles away from Sydney. Now, that's all very well when you're macho men trying to, see where you're going to be going. But as Elizabeth Everett, who was the first head of the family court in Australia, said, if women had been at the drafting, they would never have agreed to their workplace being at least 100 miles away from where they live. And in fact, this is a common issue in terms of representation in Parliament, that if you have caring responsibilities, and hopefully that's not just women anymore, then the fact that you have to travel, apart from us who live here in the ACT, or for me who lives here in the ACT, but everywhere else in the country have to travel in ways that make it very prohibitive for certain people to be members of Parliament. So thanks for letting me get that bit
Which,
into.
of course, we shouldn't neglect our WA friends who, regardless of where it was, would have to travel very long distances anyway to get here from Perth.
Yes. Well, maybe this comes into when we talk about representative democracy in that session, because I think we have to be a bit more creative about how we are represented in our Parliament and how this system, as we're talking about, makes it more onerous for some people.
Now that we're out of the Canberra miscellany.
Yes, we go back to
apologies
separation
to
of powers.
Canberrans for
It's a different
being-
type of power issue that we're talking about.
Apologies to Canberrans for lumping them in with the miscellany, but I think, again, very indicative of how Canberra gets treated in national discourse. Separation of powers. Look, it is obviously a very important topic because I think, we're getting into the political theory of it here, you quoted before we started recording this idea that, absolute power corrupts absolutely. Mm-hmm. And if we vest too much control in one arm of government, you're often going to get that arm of government using and often abusing that power.
Indeed.
And this is a thing the US framers of their constitution in the 1700s were very mindful of with regards to, the very kind of distinct push away from the monarchy under King George III and what they saw as kind of his absolute power in external affairs and colonial affairs. And, of course, King George III in real life is different from the King George III in Bridgerton. As much as we may enjoy that show, and I am definitely enjoying that show at the moment, he's not the kind of bumbling fool that we see in that program, but his government definitely was very much this kind of absolute power over the colonies, at least,
yes,
in America. And so we see the framers of that period, George Washington, Madison, everyone's favourite Hamilton, all the kind of big players in that period talking about absolute power and what it does to a system and the kind of need for balances and checks and balances is the kind of cliched term that comes about. And so we see what we see in their constitution, which obviously we've copied very closely here, is this idea where the judiciary sits separate and apart from regular government. And even, of course, in America, they go a step further than us with regards to their judiciary in that they tasked one half of the legislature the responsibility for approving judicial nominees. We don't do that here. We have direct executive appointments to the High Court and other courts, but in the US they take it even a step further and go, no, actually people's representatives should also be involved in separating these powers, which of course sounds counterintuitive because you're like, oh, but isn't that drawing in the powers? But actually, no, it's keeping them separate by keeping the executive away from extremely direct and partisan appointments. Of course, that's in theory. We see in practice in the US that isn't always the case. Indeed. Where, if the party of the president and the party of the Senate are aligned, you can see quite quick appointments, or if they're disaligned, you can see seats get held open. But again, back to this country, because this is what we're talking about. This idea that power should be separate is a very important part of the basis of our constitution, that the judiciary, at the very least, the judiciary should be separate. Of course, with the executive, we have somewhat of a different system because it's a kind of what my undergrad lecturer in Australian politics is called the Washminster system.
Indeed.
Which is kind of hybrid of the two, but
Indeed.
we do have at least a notional adherence to a separation of powers.
Well, that
definitely with the judiciary, but a notional adherence perhaps with regards to the executive.
So you're giving me the lovely segue to explaining those differences a little bit more, which is exactly that we have that structure from the US in terms of those separate chapters, but we have a slightly different system because of the influence of the Westminster system. And that influence is this concept of responsible government. So when we talk about separation of powers in Australia, it also includes the acceptance of responsible government. And that means that as we've discussed in another episode, that in order to be a member, the head of an executive branch or the member of the executive, you actually have to be elected into Parliament. And Section 64 actually specifies this. So when we talk about responsible government being in the Australian Constitution, it recognises that the head of the executive branch is the Crown. The wording is the Queen, but of course it's now the King. And so this will be another separate discussion about notions of a republic and a move to republic, but it's essentially the head of the executive branch in Australia is the Crown, the King. And what the system sets up is that the King is represented by the Governor-General. And so the Governor-General exercises those powers, and those powers are about executing the laws. And in fact, any piece of legislation passed by Parliament actually has to be signed off by the Crown or by the head of the executive. And until that happens, it's not law.
And of course, unlike in the US, there is no convention for that person to refuse assent.
There's that's really interesting, and this was sort of relevant in terms of some of the issues to do with Scott Morrison's multiple ministries. There have been occasions in Australian history, including under the period of time when I think it was Bob Hawke was Prime Minister, where the Governor-General actually encouraged the Prime Minister to go back and do a few more things before assent was given. So there have been instances that, even though you're absolutely right, the convention is for the Governor-General to act on the advice of the ministers, there still have been occasions historically. So that's an interesting point. The other really important one in terms of the traditional notion of a complete separation of power is when I draw this up on a whiteboard for my students, I do a complete border between the judiciary and the legislature and the executive, but I do a sort of staggered line between the legislature and the executive, because Section 64 demands that the Queen's Ministers of State have to be elected to Parliament. They have to hold office as a representative of the people. And that also really builds in a stronger notion of accountability for the executive branch, because ultimately we as citizens have the power to vote out individuals if we don't like what they are doing in their role as the executive branch. So it's a double accountability notion, but it's very different to the US, where you have separate ministers of state who are appointed as like the foreign minister and the attorney general and so forth.
Question for you though, Kim, because you talk about this hard line between the judiciary and the executive.
Yeah.
Is it necessarily, and this is a bit of a long question, so I'll preface that first, is it necessarily that hard of a line? I mean, take the High Court, for example. There's 7 justices on the High Court.
Yes.
They're appointed directly by the Attorney General.
Good question.
Oh, sorry, the Governor-General on the advice of the Attorney General. I should be clear with that. But again, the convention
is a cabinet decision.
The convention is that the government picks the judges, and there's no room for deliberation on that if the government has their pick. And we saw comments from former Attorney General Michaelia Cash in the Waitama government, how they were deliberately picking judges to overturn a few certain provisions, with regards to the Love and Tom's case being the kind of particular example she talked about in Parliament at the time.
Yes. So
is
good question.
If the government is, and in this case, saying the quiet part out loud, that they were trying to pick, quote, black letter law judges to overturn particular decisions that they didn't like, is there that hard a boundary there?
So that's an important question, because there's also the other question linked into that is the power of the government of the day to choose how money is spent in relation to these positions. And so if you were really wanting to undermine the independence of different institutions, you just starve it of money. So in those practical terms, there's the possibility for that to happen. But I guess the most protective aspect of it is that when a judge is appointed, they cannot be sacked unless for improper behaviour. So once the appointment is made, they're completely independent. They're not subject to the will of the government, save for that point I made about money.
And they're there until 75.
They're actually there only until the age of 70. And it's interesting you say 75, because a lot of people are complaining when they get close to 70 that they've still got plenty of years of work ahead of them. But one of the few constitutional changes that we have had is in relation to the addition in 1977 of the maximum age for judges of any court created by the Parliament is 70 years. So that's one of the other successful referenda that we have
Which,
had
of course,
held.
is itself its own kind of separation
Protection.
of powers, because
Correct.
it creates this thing where you, again, comparative to the US, you get
Yes.
judges who are there until they drop dead.
Indeed.
Or resign at an appropriate time, which is more often what we see now, judges choosing when certain governments are in power to resign. You don't have that here. Of course, I'll single out perhaps Justice Edelman, who's there for quite a while.
Yes, indeed.
There's no way to tell in 2036, I think, which is the year he has to retire. I think it's maybe 2044, but it's several decades away. There's no way to tell who's going to be in government that far out, so you can't time it. There's no way a future government can
Indeed.
time out who's going to be in power that far in advance.
And the other aspect of it is that once they're appointed, as I said, they're not having to feel like they have to please the government of the day necessarily or be responsive to that. They have to act lawfully. I mean, the role is a rule of law notion, and so they have to interpret the law. And an example of a judge who was sort of presumed to be more conservative and ended up being the judge that presided over the case that introduced an implied freedom of political communication was Anthony Mason. And Anthony Mason, when he was appointed by a Conservative government, the government probably never anticipated that he would be making those what might be called more progressive activist decisions, reading things into the Constitution. So in that sense, the real separation comes from their independence once they are appointed. But the process of appointing, and this is actually up for discussion, as maybe there would be a better way to enable less political or partisan appointment by having some committee that recommends, and in fact we see in the federal court and in tribunals amendments to encourage non-direct appointments from the executive, but committees of representatives to recommend to the government of the day, and that making
we
it
see
a
in
less
some other
partisan.
countries other than Australia where judges are kind of the government gets presented the lists, three to five judges that a committee of other judges have selected, and
Yes.
then from that list the government gets to pick, which is kind of somewhat on merit, but
Yes.
still retains the notion of choice, that the government does have the right to appoint judges because they're elected, and this kind of idea of the executive is the executive are accountable.
Yes, indeed.
So if judges and judicial choice is your particular issue in an election, you can vote in or out your representative based on who they've appointed. Not that I've met anybody yet, in Australia at least, who finds judicial appointments as their kind of key passion for voting, but nonetheless, it does give you the option if you were so incensed by the appointment of Justice Edelman. Not to pick on him, he's a very lovely man, but if you were so incensed by that choice, or
it would
Justice
be a
Kirby,
relevant factor.
If that was, you have the right
as a citizen in
to
your choices who you
punish
elect.
the executive and the not the judiciary, punish the executive and the legislature.
Yes, indeed.
For that choice, because the executive is still
responsible.
accountable.
Exactly. And to sort of flesh out the power of the executive and the need to have a check on executive power, it comes back to sort of this principle: when people are elected, if there isn't some sort of check on their power, then it is very easy to be motivated by the desire to maintain power rather than the desire, which is often animating people when they want to run for Parliament, to obviously make good policy and to represent the people. But there is something about this notion of power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely that we can see without being specific about anybody, but just the nature of holding power. There must be something that's quite addictive about it, in the sense of wanting to continue to hold power. And so the whole rationalisation of pragmatism versus policy becomes fraught at times. So if you have these checks on power, then it's a protection to us as individuals in society. And I guess that's the point to come back to, which is that we're talking about all of these principles under a concept of the rule of law. And the rule of law is that when we elect people, they can't just do whatever they want. They have to act lawfully. And the way we bolster them acting lawfully is these notions of accountability through responsible government, but also through this system of separation of powers, where you have the judiciary having a role to keep a check on the lawfulness of decision-making.
Yeah, the legislature as well.
On the legislature as well. And this is where it might be nice to finish off this section, because really what the role of the court is to check that the Constitution is being enforced and upheld. So with the High Court having this rule of law function, it has two sort of roles in terms of reviewing lawfulness under the Constitution. One is whether the Parliament actually has the power to make a law, so they're the constitutional decisions. But it also has a role in terms of good governance and the executive when it is responsible for implementing the laws. So when a government decision maker is given a discretion under an act, say it's about someone's good character, then when it makes a decision, it can't just decide good character for any reason whatsoever, like James has got brown eyes and therefore I don't believe he's got good character. It has to be based on good governance and
Should
good
add, I have
policy.
blue eyes, so I have great character.
I'm sitting far enough away. And these are known as administrative law principles where an individual who's affected by a decision can, under this Constitution, under Section 75.5, go to the High Court and ask for review on the grounds of whether it's lawful or not, under those sorts of administrative law procedural fairness issues. And that's another really important check on executive power, in that the court, as a separate body, can look at that decision. But what's really important is that when the court looks at that decision, it doesn't remake the decision. It just talks about the process being unlawful, and then it goes back to the decision maker to make lawfully. And often, and we see this a lot in migration decisions, a lot of the time the same decision is made, but the lawful process has been followed. And so for the individual, they might not necessarily be better off with the outcome, but we are all better off as a society because at least the proper processes has been followed.
Of course, we can think of that family from Billawheeler that had multiple reconsiderations in their favour, but again, the same decision kept getting made negatively against their outcome. Of course, they're now in Australia.
Yes, because the policy changed.
Having policy change and the government changed, and that's an electoral thing. But because that's an electoral thing. But yeah, so this idea about the voice doesn't necessarily. The idea of the court being involved doesn't necessarily change the outcome of the decisions. It's not going to create this backlog where ministerial decisions get overturned.
Yes.
But it may create the circumstance where the process.
Yes.
And again, this is what the voice is about. It's about changing the way in which policy is developed.
So,
the way in which executive decisions get developed. Of course, before we get too much into that,
yes,
we've talked about the court getting involved. There's also the Parliament itself has a role in
executive
regulation.
And that parliamentary role is also interesting in the sense of having a lower and an upper house, because, of course, the government of the day and part of responsible government, which fits in with our separation of powers analysis, is that generally in order to form a government, you've got to have a majority. And the Governor-General is called on, and in our system we generally have a clear government of the day, although during Julia Gillard's period of Prime Minister, there was a hung parliament and she had to get the support of the independents in the House to form a government. But generally that government is formed. But it's very rare to have the government of the day having a majority in the Senate, which means that the Senate has a crucial role in this idea of disallowances of regulations. Do you want to say a little bit more about those?
Yeah, so this idea of disallowance motions, basically under the legislation, the government has a very broad authority in determining what legislation looks like in terms of the actual implementation, like what it looks like for the department or the agency or the body that's tasked with actually implementing the law. The minister has a very strong role in kind of setting the rules, the terms of engagement, the different policy outcomes. But the Parliament has a role in overseeing that as well. So in most legislation that comes from most what's called delegated legislation, when the minister has delegated powers, delegated authorities by the Parliament, Parliament still has oversight in that. So the Parliament, both houses of Parliament, it's not just confined to the Senate. Although I can't think of an example where the lower house has disallowed a motion or disallowed a regulation
because of that principle that they form the government of the day.
The government forms the majority in that house, although a hung Parliament could conceivably have that role to play, but it's often the Senate. Is where the Senate, it comes before the Senate, and if the Senate so votes or so decides, can disallow the regulation.
It's got a particular time frame, and if it hasn't disallowed it, then it goes into force. And sometimes there are tricky periods where something has been disallowed, and so at what point did a decision become unlawful becomes the the issue for.
But it does create this role of the parliament, at
Yes.
least the role of the upper house.
Yes.
Of course, the role of both houses technically, but again, no lower house
Yes.
ever disallowed a motion in that
Yeah.
sense, comparative to the Senate, and the Senate disallows a fair number of them.
Yes.
Because more often than not, the party of government
Yes.
is not in power, and more often than not, the Senate is in an oppositional political leaning to the lower house. Even just broadly speaking, obviously the Senate has quite a large crossbench, and I can point out the work of the Greens or Rex Patrick and some previous parliaments being involved as crossbench senators to get
Moving disallowance motions.
And what it does is essentially says to the government, we as a Senate, we the Parliament, are not willing to go along with your interpretation of said act.
Yes.
We feel your decision is as at odds with the way in which the legislation that we as a body passed. And it prevents the government from essentially having carte blanche over every minute decision in
Yes.
legislation that they're given authority to do. And of course, they need the authority to do these decisions to run effective government. And no Senate is there disallowing every bit of legislation. They're not out there kind of putting a block on every little minute area of policy. But there are some examples where
They
the
have
Senate
stood in.
feels that you've gone too far on that.
And I think that this is, links back to the fundamental theme of this podcast of separating power, that the whole idea is by having these different mechanisms that our Constitution has set up, it recognises that there are different structural protections. And this is relevant then to the voice, isn't it, in terms of the desire from the Uluru Dialogues for the voice to not only be able to make representations to Parliament, but also to the executive branch.
Yeah, well, I mean, the very presence of disallowance motions speaks to this. It speaks to the fact that the executive has a lot of power when it comes to administrative law, when it comes to the processes of law, the processes of governance. And the proposed amendment to the Constitution, which is will be included in the podcast notes for this episode.
Yes.
And all of the episodes.
For the whole episode.
Is
whole series.
such that the Voice of Parliament has the power to advise the executive branch. That's really important because the executive branch has a lot of authority in decision making in terms of who is included in the scope of a policy or the amounts of scope that are included, who has the right to appeal certain decisions or make certain decisions, how they're made, where they're made, or for whom they're made. All these kind of day-to-day governance questions are decided not at the parliamentary level, not by your senators or your MPs, but by ministers and by department secretaries or assistant secretaries, or I could list all the APS grades, but I used to live in Canberra, where that's kind of inherent knowledge to someone who's in Canberra. You know all the APS grades, but those decisions are made by those people. They're not made by senators or
Members of
MPs.
Parliament.
So it's important for the voice to be able to speak to those as well, because yes, it's important. Obviously, it's important we speak to the Parliament, and it is a voice to Parliament. It's important that we get the legislation right in the first place, and it's important the legislation is designed in such a way that it's right in the first place, and that is a very important part of the process. But also, it's about implementing the legislation, how it looks on the ground. And I think for a lot of Indigenous communities who are supporting the voice and who are pushing for this change in the Constitution, we see day to day in our communities what that looks like in terms of government implementation. Centrelink decisions, for example, are bureaucratic decisions. They're not parliamentary ones. They are decisions at the discretion of the department
Following
on the
leg-
authority of the minister, which of course has that authority from the Parliament, but no Parliament is going to revoke the authority of the Minister for Human Services to make those decisions. Therefore, a voice of Parliament, if it's going to have an impact on
Good policy.
Centrelink decision making, which is an area that does impact our people quite a lot. And that's just one example there. We needed the ability to speak to Centrelink, to speak to the particular department or minister.
Indeed.
Obviously, we can speak to the minister as a member of Parliament, as a senator, but then you're speaking to them as an elected representative, not as a member of the executive, because there still is the separation of powers. There is a difference of roles.
Exactly.
And you can see it with the examples of staffers. It's perhaps a good example for people. Parliamentarians who are ministers have electorate staff who deal with their issues as an elected representative, and then they have ministerial staff who deal with
Policy
their role as a
issues.
member of the executive. These are very different roles, and you can't switch back and forth between, or you can, switch back and forth between them, but they're very
They're separate roles.
They're separate roles.
Part
they're
of
separate,
separation of powers.
separate
concepts.
ideas. So again, the idea of speaking to the executive is very important because most of the decisions that affect our people are coming from that realm of government, from the executive.
Yes.
Yes, again, the legislation is important, but it's equally as important to speak to the other arm of government obviously not the judiciary, but it's the other arm of government, the executive, that has a lot of impact on day-to-day bureaucratic decision-making, because that really is a very important aspect of our government.
And on that note, I think we will finish our Separation of Powers podcast. Thanks, James. This podcast was proudly produced at the University of Canberra on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. Special thanks to Rach White for her production. If you would like to find out more about the topics discussed in this episode, the Australian Constitution and the referendum on the voice to Parliament, please refer to the show notes for some useful links. The theme music for this podcast series is How to Vote by Patrick Hazler.